I'm a fan of the Netflix series called The Office, and I'm sure so many of you out there must also be fans of The Office, the Netflix series. Maybe not the workplaces where you have to show up every day to make a living, but definitely the Netflix series. Let me know in the comments section if you're a fan of The Office and who your favorite character is. Is it Michael Scott or Dwight or Andy or Pam and Jim, whoever it happens to be? It's sort of a cozy environment as the door opens and there's people sitting next to each other, what the traditional office used to look like. And you and I, we all know the office of 2022 and going beyond does not look like anything. And what we saw in that series, not that a lot of the stuff that was shown in the series should not be happening at any workplace, but the workplace is evolving, long story short, and we need to relook at how we approach the workplace. I'm reminded of a quote by Albert Einstein who said, "New problems need new solutions. We should stop applying old solutions to new problems." Well, the workplace has evolved and therefore leadership needs to evolve with it. And help is at hand today in this episode of the Beginner's Mind series, because joining us is Professor Peter Cappelli, who's the George W. Taylor Professor of Management at the Wharton School and Director of Wharton's Center for Human Resources. He's the author of several books, such as The Future of the Office, Why Good People Can't Get Jobs, Managing the Older Worker with Bill Novelli, The India Way, Managing Talent in an Age of Uncertainty, and The New Deal at Work. All of these interesting books, and we'll be taking a deep dive into certain of these topics today as we move forward. Professor Capelli was named by the HR magazine as one of the top 5 influential management thinkers, by NPR as one of the 50 influencers in the field of aging, and was elected a Fellow of the National Academy of Human Resources. He's a regular contributor to the Wall Street Journal and writes a monthly column for HR Executive Magazine. His work on HR and workplace topics appears regularly in the Harvard Business Review. Please join me in welcoming Professor Peter Cappelli today.
Good.
You're welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Yeah, we even have virtual applause, so it makes all the difference with these little sound effects added in. Well, thank you for taking out the time today, Professor Cappelli. My first question, if I may jump right into it, is from your experience, what does the future of work look like? Is the office going away anytime soon? What are the strong trends that are emerging? I know there's a lot of videos out there and your opinion already out there on this subject back in 2021 when we were in the mid of the pandemic. Have things changed now as we move forward? How do you see the traditional workplace evolving? What are the strongest trends emerging at the moment?
Yeah, well, thank you. It's of course a topic that's getting a lot of attention, and the future of work has many possible different dimensions. Some of them are more likely than others, and I think, frankly, we are much more engaged by the possibilities than the reality. The reality is never as interesting as the possibilities, right? So we all know what drove the office issue. What we might not know is that besides from the pandemic, employers have been fiddling around with offices for a very long time, basically trying to cut real estate costs.
Right.
And some of this started first in modern times in the 1970s in the U.S. in California because of the problem of smog, which many of us forgot, but those of you who live near Delhi, for example, probably understand this. The air pollution was so bad that they stopped people from driving on some days. So people had to work from home, and all they had were telephones, and that's where telecommuting came from, the phrase that's still used here. And so we studied that quite a bit, what happened to people who were telecommuting. And then in the early 2000s .com period, a different issue popped up. And that issue was the very expensive real estate in Silicon Valley when it was booming, and Silicon Valley companies trying to do what we're seeing now, which is to send people to work from home. And the idea was to save office space. And there were some companies that did this quite famously. IBM claimed at least one of its divisions that 40% of its employees were permanently remote, people who are dealing with clients and customers. And the joke at IBM was that IBM stood for I'm by myself because there was no office for you anymore. So this is not exactly a new issue. But of course, what changed with the pandemic was that this was done at scale, right? And employers who thought it was a bad idea to ever try this had no choice but to do it. And so in the U.S., by some measures, 70% of office workers were working remotely. And I think the punchline is it worked better than the employers certainly thought it was going to. Of course, they were anticipating a disaster. And so it worked better. And for many employees, and arguably you might say most employees, it was something they kind of preferred. The problem is, once you have people out this long, now it's been, of course, 2 years, getting them back in is kind of tricky because they've kind of got used to this. So the question is, will it happen or not? So going forward, will we be bringing people back to the office or not? And what we're seeing basically is a lot of arguments about the fact that employees like it, which is not a big surprise. And therefore, I think sometimes a belief that it's just going to happen because employees like it.
Right.
The problem, of course, is all employees know this. You don't necessarily get what you want. And unless it pays for the employer, is this going to happen or not? And that's where it's not quite so clear. I think thinking about it from the employer's perspective, it is not so obvious why they're going to continue doing this. One view is that, it's just cheaper now because people want to do it. And so you can hire people more easily if you offer this. You can pay them less. Okay, that's true. Of course, you could do that for lots of things.
Right.
The issue is, does it pay off for the employer otherwise, or is it just a pain to do this? And there it's just not so clear what's really going on. However, here's, I think, the big way to think about it. It's one thing to say that your current employees during the crisis of the pandemic could stay home and be productive. Part of the reason is they've all been used to working in the office before. They more or less all know how things work. It's another thing when you've got new hires who have never been in the office.
Right.
To try to get them to work remotely is a very difficult thing. And after a year or two of hiring people during the pandemic, you got a lot of people who would never have been in the office. Can you get those people to be productive? You know, that's the first issue on this. And I think the second issue is with things like teamwork and project work, does it actually work as well in with Zoom as it remote as it does in person? The evidence that we know on that from prior research is no, it doesn't. And so the question really is going to be, yes, your current employees like it better, but is it actually working overall for the employer? There, I think the evidence is just not so clear. So my bet is going to see, as we have already, more employers bringing people back. If you look at the data across the world, you can see in Europe, and especially on the continent, employers have largely brought people back. In the U.S. and the U.K. are the outliers in having the most people who are still remote.
Right.
So where are we going to go in the future? I think my bet is more people are coming back. Exactly how many will come back? That's a little difficult to say.
In fact, as we speak today, it was just yesterday that I read about 100 companies in the UK have signed up for a 4-2 experiment with the 4-day work week as well, and that's one of the new initiatives. As you rightly say, here in India, the trends are also pointing towards a similar direction, where a lot of companies now want people to come back. It's interesting. You talk about the real estate costs. And that this whole thing was conceived as a way out of high real estate costs. And now there's companies sitting on huge inventory of, office space, which is underutilized because only 30 to 40% of the workforce is showing up And these are offices right in the most, the most expensive areas of cities. So bosses do want people to come back. And there's other issues such as increased micromanagement. And that's going to lead me to the next question about trust, because hybrid or people coming back to work full time or, whatever the percentage happens to be, trust has been as a major issue, building trust with these virtual teams, which are scattered across the world. And as you rightly pointed out, some of them have never been into the culture, haven't been properly assimilated. New hires, new recruits, and you just see faces on the screens. They haven't had the opportunity. In fact, this July 2020 study in the HBR pointed out that a fifth of remote workers felt their supervisor was constantly evaluating their work, those who were working remotely. 1/3 agreed that supervisors expressed a lack of confidence in their work skills, which is way higher than when they were in proximity, because they could, without interrupting, they could see what the other person was up to or have a feel of whether he or she is headed in the right direction. And now there is more, there's more insecurity in a lot of managers as to what people are doing, and hence the increase in surveillance softwares to figure out how much time a person is on their desktop, etc. How do you think all of this will affect engagement numbers and culture and the way we lead and the way we work in the long run? How do you think this is going to impact?
Yeah. Well, just to back up just half a step before that, I think one of the reasons that employees reported they liked working remotely is, at least initially, employers trusted them. Now, they trusted them because they had no choice, right?
Right.
But also, we were all in it together, right? Your boss was working remotely. Your colleagues were all working remotely. And because of that, it was kind of a leveling effect. And also, the employer was asking for your help, saying, look, we got to keep this business going, or you're all going to lose your jobs, too. And all that caused people to pull together. So I think on the employer's perspective, they probably are wondering now, okay, well, the crisis is over. Pandemic is becoming something we're learning to live with this virus. And nobody really believes your business is about to go under or the country's going under. And maybe it's the case that employees are not nearly as conscientious. But I think the thing employees liked about working remotely, we just assume it's that they didn't like to commute. And I think, for a lot of people that was true, but not for everybody. I can tell you my commute was a walk to work, so it's a terrible thing. What they liked was the fact that they had control over their time, right? So I'm working longer. The evidence seems to suggest that people are working longer when they're working remotely, but I can take breaks when I want. I can go take the dog for a walk. I can greet my kids when they come home from school and get them settled down. And then I go back to work after that. So I think that's what they liked was the, this we are all in this together thing, and the trust they had from employers and the control they had. I think the problem is, certainly from the U.S., my sense is that employers never had a very good idea what their white-collar workers were doing, frankly. We didn't have good performance management. We had got worse at performance appraisals. And so you had a lot of employers who didn't trust their employees very much, but they had no choice during the pandemic. Now the pandemic's over, and they don't trust their employees, but they're working remotely. So we've seen a big expansion of tattleware software. And this is the stuff, that's monitoring you all the time. So, a third of U.S. workers say they put tape over the camera on their computer so the employers can't see it.
Right.
There's all kinds of ways to get around this software. So we got a problem now, right? Because if you do that, if you don't trust the employees and you start monitoring them, it will really kill any trust that remains, and you'll have employees working remotely who are really irritated at you. That's not going to work very well. And then you could start to see this downward loop, right? The downward loop is then employees get irritated at you, and then the employer gets irritated because you're not working, and then we say, darn it, we got to bring you all back to the office so I can stand over you and watch you.
Right.
Despite the fact that we just did this exercise where you made the whole thing work. So I think the problem for employers is, okay, how are you going to manage this? And the answer, as you say, is you've got to create trust if you lost it. And the trust that matters to employees is, as you say, the micromanagement. Tell me what I got to do,
Right.
but leave me alone to do it. And don't feel the need to be checking up on what I'm doing every 10 minutes and whether I'm sitting in front of my screen or not, that's just going to be a disaster. Now, that requires a different kind of management and a different kind of supervision. The good thing is we had some of that during the pandemic, and that means let's lay out in advance precisely what you want me to do, how are you going to measure it, and also, what it's going to look like when I'm done, so that I know and when I've done a good job or not. That requires a little more planning up front from supervisors.
Right.
And it requires a little more discipline. We're going to meet on Tuesday afternoon and talk a little bit about how things are going, right? Rather than just popping in to kind of check on you and then irritated because you're not there. But maybe I shouldn't be. Maybe I should only be concerned about your performance. But that's a different way of managing. It's better, but it's going to require more supervisors.
Sure. So if I'm understanding you correctly, we should give this whole thing sufficient time so that we're able to evaluate rather than quickly jumping back to the old ways of how we did things earlier. And it turns out that we probably led better during the crisis than in normal times. Engagement numbers went up during the crisis, for example. The employee engagement numbers went up. As you rightly said, since people had no option, bosses or small businesses or employers didn't have an option, they had to trust people, and things worked okay. Right. And now that things are back to normal, we've certainly scrutinizing a lot more, and we've taken a different view of things, and that's backfiring in many cases. So probably the lesson here for many corporations is to give this whole thing a little bit more time to see what's the optimum thing that emerges out of it.
Well, I think the employers have a right to be concerned because in the pandemic period, they had all these other things going for them. One is people were just grateful to have a job and not be in the office and be exposed to the virus. And that's gone. And the we are all in this together is gone as well because your bosses went back to the office. So you've lost that. And can you make it up? And you can, right? But the problem is we don't want to be in a downward spiral of trust, which I think is what's happened. And that is employers now are saying, oh, well, they've been out for a long time. I don't know. Can we trust them? I don't know. Let's start monitoring. And just to make sure. And now that we have a choice, let's start monitoring. You start monitoring, trust goes away. Trust goes away. Particularly discretionary performance begins to drop, and then employers want to monitor more, and then they start saying we got to bring everybody back. So I think the big thing is we've got to get more systematic about performance management.
Right.
The pandemic carried employee discretion and engagement because so many other things are going on. It's probably true now that if you just leave employees alone, they'll get lazy. I do. I imagine everybody would. And start paying more attention to other things. So what does that mean? It being more purposeful and clear about performance management, which means here's what you have to do this week. Here's what we're going to measure. Here's the goal. We want to check in and see how things are going. Not every day, maybe, and certainly not several times during the day, but just, on Tuesday, we're going to meet and talk about how this is going, right?
Right.
I think the other thing we have to do is figure out when face-to-face is really important. The most depressing statistic I heard, which comes from some Microsoft data, is that during the pandemic, meeting time went up by 25%, or 27%, actually, right? Because most everybody thinks we had way too many meetings in the office. And if we've got, a quarter more meetings now than we had in the office at home, how could that possibly be a good thing? So another thing we got to think about is our use of meetings. When do we really need people in the office? And maybe we do for meetings and other kinds of interactions. And let's figure that out. And also let's get better at managing Zoom and virtual interactions, they don't work as well. And doing more of them is not a good idea, which is what we're doing.
Mm-hmm. So I think in that quote is apt here. We need new solutions to new problems, as you rightly pointed out about performance management systems and other things. This is a great opportunity to relook and figure out what are the new ways which are appropriate for this new environment. In one of your LinkedIn articles that you published, you wrote, in a hybrid office, remote workers will be left behind, which is concerning given the fact that a lot of them want to do at least some part of their work week. They want to work remotely. And then there is the bias as well, the bias that bosses have, human beings have. If you see somebody around more often, you tend to like them more. The likability bias kicks in. The availability bias kicks in, and you tend to assume that these are the people who are necessarily working harder and producing greater output. So, how can business leaders, as they migrate to, as we figure out what the optimum mix is going to be, as the dust settles down, how can business leaders ensure a level playing ground for those who are working remotely, given also the fact that remote work gave many people the chance to avoid office politics or toxic environments, or some statistics even indicate minorities and women did well in remote work as they would in a physical work environment. So it has its plus side as well. But how can bosses ensure that there can be a level playing ground until we figure out what the future actually is going to be?
Okay, yeah. So let me back up a little bit. Tell you first of all, what do we know from the research on this, which looked at people who were out of the office when their peers were in the office. And not surprisingly, everything is worse for them. Their commitment levels are lower because commitment is, frankly, largely tied to personal connections. I don't really feel so connected to the company, the corporate logo. I feel connected to my bosses and my coworkers. I don't see them. I don't feel as connected to them. That's a hard thing to fix. Because I'm not in the office, I don't know quite what's going on as well as people who are there. And as you say, there's also the ability to impress people, which is easier if you're in the office, and the ability to to talk to bosses and things informally is still a lot easier. Some of those things are almost impossible, at least at present, to fix.
Sure.
For example, you probably all know this. If you're in the office and you really wanted to catch the boss for something, don't bother trying to get on her calendar, right? Because their scheduler is not going to give you a half hour of time on their schedule. But when she walks to the car. Right. And so you just happen to be out there when she's walking to the car and you can pass along something. And there was a great quote from, I think it was the head of PwC, maybe it was in the UK, saying that that's what he missed the most about the pandemic was catching people or having them catch him and pass things along quickly and informally. We don't have a good way to do that yet.
Right.
So there is a real problem if you are the person who is remote and your colleagues are in the office. If we're talking about everybody being remote, then the playing field is kind of level. If we're talking everybody be hybrid, then I suppose it's kind of level as well, right? The issue comes when people can choose. And I think bosses, understandably, but it's probably not great, recognize that people who are raising their hand to say, I want to be in with the bosses, are more ambitious. And they are going to be probably rewarded for that. Now, you might say that's unfair, but what do we do to counter that? I think, by the way, the evidence about women and minorities is not, I don't think this is that they actually did better. It is they felt better. And they felt better because they felt insulated from what they otherwise were seeing possibly as slights and things. That doesn't mean it's better for you to be out of your office if your peers are in the office. It is worse for you to be out of the office if your peers are in the office on every measure of outcome we know. So, how could we fix this? Well, I don't think you can, to be honest. I think we're so, we've been so informal about the way we manage people And to manage people who are remote as well as we manage people who are face-to-face requires such structure that it kind of defeats the purpose of having face-to-face, which is the informal immediacy of it. If you try to treat everybody the same, and every interaction is going to be scheduled because that's what it has to be like for people who are on Zoom, that's going to kill the point of being in the office, right? So I think as good as we can do is more structure around performance management. It's the same solution, right? And that is, think about, okay, we're going to talk to everybody every week about how things are going. People in the office as well. We're going to have this conversation, with you on Tuesday afternoon, and with her on Wednesday morning, and not long conversations. I'm not thinking about weekly performance appraisals, but quick 10-minute check-ins or so about how things are going. And very clear statements about what are we expecting you to accomplish this week. That takes a lot of work. And I can tell you, at least in the U.S., we have moved in the opposite direction. Less training for supervisors, wider spans of control, which mean more people to supervise, and making the supervisors do a bunch of other things as individual contributors. And then, oh, by the way, you are supposed to be supervising all these other folks. So it would be a massive change for organizations, and it's going to require massive amounts of time, which equals money to do this. And so if you are the subordinate, if you are the person thinking about working remotely, I would go into this with your eyes open, and expecting that the employer is going to figure out how to put you on a level playing field compared to people who are in the office. There's an expression here in Philadelphia, which is this one. It says, God bless. And that means basically, you're going to need it because this is not going to work well.
Yeah, the tone says it all, right? Yeah. Right.
It says it all.
It's one of those God bless moments, right? Where you like good luck moments. No, so would it be right to infer, if I'm driven, if I want to succeed and do well in whatever I'm doing right now, I should move away from my screen, from my home office. I should be in the office more. Would that be right too? Would be a right inference? Okay, great.
I think especially if you are new, if you're a new employee, and especially for maybe the children, many of our listeners, if they're starting their first job and they have the opportunity to be remote, don't do it.
Okay.
Go into the office. That's where you meet people, and that's where you're going to learn what's going on. There's an interesting statistic from my generation, people sort of middle age and older, in my case, that 22% of them in the U.S. met their spouse at work.
Right.
All right. You're not going to be at work. That cuts down on your social interactions, right?
Yeah,
and there's an interesting study that just came out about social interactions for remote workers. And it found that people are communicating more, certainly on Zoom, within their little work group.
Right.
And less more broad.
Outside.
Right?
Agreed.
So your networks, even in the company, that is your networks within the company, are shrinking down when we move remotely, right? So, you want to have a wide network, and especially when you're starting out.
Sure.
And anything you're doing that's going to narrow that is going to be tricky.
So there you go. Single folks out there, more incentive for you. All the more incentive to show up at work. Zoom is not the most optimum place to maybe where an office romance can start. So head for the office, guys. Right.
Sure.
Right. Okay. I'm going to move now towards the title of one of your books, Professor Capelli. We said why good people don't get jobs. And we hear business leaders, entrepreneurs, startups all the time complaining they can't find enough good people. So here's the conundrum here. So one set of people looking for good people, and then good people can't find enough jobs. Is there a skill mismatch? Is there a mindset mismatch? Is there a mismatch of expectations? Why don't good people find good jobs?
Yeah. And this is the employer's responsibility, right? It's one of the functions of management within human resources. It is the hot one these days. Talent acquisition, which is not a phrase that we used to hear ever before. It's a contemporary invention. And it's a contemporary invention, at least in the U.S., because so few companies are doing much of anything to find talent within their company. That is, they're not developing people from within. They're not filling positions internally. They're going outside to hire for everything. So one of the reasons that talent acquisition is such a big issue, and this is certainly, I think, true in India as well. Turnover rates in India are pretty high, particularly in the big cities, right?
Yep.
Is that hiring is such a big deal because we're doing way more of it. We're doing way more of it because most of it is just backfilling the positions of people who have quit to go work someplace else. And because they're quitting in part because we're not filling positions from within. So it's it's a vicious cycle.
Right.
So the first thing to do on the employer side is to ask yourself, how many vacancies are we filling from within? It's astonishing how few employers know that. It's a simple thing to figure out, right? But in the days of the great corporations in the U.S., it would have been 90% of vacancies were filled from within.
Okay.
The figures in the U.S. now, we've gone from about 90% to 25%.
Whoops.
And it used to be, too, that positions from outside were almost all filled at a couple of levels. We used to call them entry-level jobs, right? And you could get good at hiring for entry-level jobs because you're doing it all the time.
Right.
But now we're filling vacancies up and all the way down the organization chart.
Right.
So we're filling different kinds of jobs. We're just doing a lot more of it. It's hard to get good at it.
Sure.
So the first thing is, could we get better at filling positions from within? If we could cut our turnover down, we could cut our hiring needs down enormously. But the other problem is when we go to hire, you always hear these talent shortage problems in the following context. It's when the economy has been down and it starts to pick up. Right? After the Great Recession in the U.S., which is when I wrote that book, we had all these complaints that there was nobody to hire. And it actually was worse like in 2012 or 2013, just after the Great Recession, when we still had high levels of unemployment. It was worse then than it was later on. Why is that? It's because employers didn't adjust their expectations.
Right.
So, during downturns, employers can be quite picky. And then when the labor market begins to turn, they can't be quite so picky. And what happens is it's hard for them to adjust. So we used to be able to hire at this wage people with 5 years experience and a college degree, etc. And I can't find those people anymore. What's the matter? Well, it's pretty clear what happened, right? The labor market just tightened. In 2013 in the U.S. or so, companies were trying to hire skilled machinists, which is quite a job with a lot of skill, at $15 an hour. And $15 an hour is now what McDonald's is paying, right? And they couldn't find this. Then they started not to be able to find them. Well, there's a machinist shortage. No, there's not. The market just shifted, and you got to pay more. So the thing for employers, I think, is to rethink their hiring requirements. Do you really need somebody with 5 years experience to do this job? And do you really need somebody with a college degree to fill this job? So what has happened, certainly in the U.S. for sure, and maybe this is true in other countries, is we started to skimp on human resources. We started to cut back the number of recruiters. And we make line managers do the hiring. And line managers are not good at it. Not surprising. How would they get good at it? And here's the simplest problem that they do all the time. They say, okay, we got to fill this position. What are we looking for in terms of job requirements? So I ask the 5 of you who work with me, what do you think would be important to have? Then they each make a list. And so I look at it and say, okay, let's put all these things on there. And once you start adding requirements to jobs, it becomes more and more difficult to fill them. And it costs more and more money to find somebody who can do those jobs.
Right.
So as part of that book, my funniest anecdote, people were writing to me about their crazy hiring practices. And one company told me they had 25,000 applicants for a reasonably standard engineering job. And none of the applicants could meet the hiring criteria. They had 25,000 applicants.
Gosh.
Nobody could meet the criteria. Well, how is that? Well, because you think about each requirement has to be met. So if you've got a 50% chance of meeting the first one and a 50% chance of meeting the second one. The odds of finding somebody are not 0.5, it's 0.25. You multiply those probabilities. You start stringing several of these together, and you end up with probabilities that are incredibly low. So we need to rethink, basically, our hiring and be more reasonable. And eventually employers figure that out, but for a few years they're screaming about there's nobody to hire, when all that's happened is the labor market has shifted a little bit against them. That's really what's going on. So this is an employer's problem.
Right.
At least in the U.S., they keep trying to turn this into a public policy problem. We're not going to hire anybody and train anybody. We want to hire somebody who can immediately step into that job. Well, I understand wanting to do that. I want to do that too. But what happens when you can't do it? Do you expect the state government to find somebody for you? Well, they can't do it. So we're going to have to stop complaining and do something about it.
Right. And talking about college education and the requirement for a degree, and given your vast experience, do you think higher education needs a major disruption in the way we teach, in the way we prepare leaders of the corporate world for the future?
Well, I think candidates and their parents have looked to higher education because there's no place else to look. So, how can my kid get a good job in a good company? Well, you look at what they're hiring for, and what do they want? Well, they want experience. Okay, well, how does a new college graduate get experience?
Right.
They say, well, and they want these quite specific skills. Well, where do they get those? So the bad thing is that the colleges in the U.S. anyway have tried to respond to this. I wrote a book about this called "Will College Pay Off?" because my colleagues in the economics world have been arguing for a long time about how important it is to have a college degree.
Right.
But at least in the U.S., the big problem is you can go to college and not get a degree. And it looks like a huge percentage of people never graduate. And if you have to borrow a lot of money to go to college, and if you go to the wrong kind of college, that could do you no good, even if you graduate.
Right. End up with student loans.
The problem is student loans and degrees that might not be particularly useful. So the problem is college is not set up to provide job training. It's just not good at it. And what you see in the U.S. happening is most schools now have started to offer internships. And I'm sure in India you're seeing this as well, particularly in the private schools, right?
Right.
And the reason they offer internships is employers like them. If you're the government paying for college, though, or you're a parent paying for college, this is quite an expensive proposition because you're paying college tuition,
right?
Basically for your kid to be able to work for somebody, right? In a job, excuse me, that's the same kind of job they probably would be doing when they graduate. So is this a good thing? Well, it's not in terms of public policy. It's not for parents, but nevertheless, this seems to be what employers have forced on students. Okay, we need experience. You're not going to hire us and give it to us, so we got to get it before we get to you. And the colleges are offering us a way to do it, so that's what we're going to do. So I think the short answer is, do colleges have to adjust? Well, colleges are adjusting in a way that kind of works for the students and I guess kind of works for the employer. But it is really inefficient way to do it, super inefficient way. And particularly when you look at skilled trades, like becoming a plumber or something like that, trying to learn that in school is really a really inefficient way to do it. India has way better apprentice programs than the U.S. has. But if you look around the world, every place has better apprenticeship programs than the U.S. has. It requires some government effort to make these things happen. It requires some consistent employer effort to make this happen. And in Europe, they've been pretty good at it. In India, you've been better at it than the U.S. Most countries of the world have realized that at the apprentice level, we've got to do something systematic at the government level to make this happen. But also at the white-collar level now, too. It's the same issues.
It is.
How can we get better at this?
Right.
the U.S. were really bad. Many of the bigger Indian companies, of course, are quite good at this, right? They hire people and convert them into IT people. You know, don't need an IT degree to do this. But we probably need this on a bigger scale.
Right.
And we probably can't expect anybody but the biggest companies to afford to be, able to make this happen. So what are we going to do? Maybe colleges can be part of this solution, but I don't think we should rely on them to do the job skills part of it. The UK has an interesting model, or had an interesting model, where they, and people don't, not everybody likes this model, it's not nearly as good as it ought to be, but that during the Great Recession, the aftermath of it in particular, the government would pay for 1 day of training if you were paying for 4 days of work for your new hire people out of school.
Okay.
And they would pay for reasonably standard training on production work or on white-collar work that would help somebody learn how to be a good employee, not just for you, but for any place. And maybe some mixing of government and private that way has to be the way we go, even for white-collar work.
Sure. We had a huge problem here, and especially I observed it in the north of the country, other parts as well, a huge explosion of business schools. So everybody after doing a bachelor's degree would want to do an MBA. It was the trending thing 4 to 5 years ago. So the first thing, a lot of people jumped into this business, into the business of providing private education because it was lucrative. You would lock in this captive audience for the next 2 to 3 years and make money out of that. And youngsters would spend a lot of money to get that title, MBA, and there was no actual addition in terms of their skills, what the job market, and you had a huge chunk of these people jobless later on. Same happened within many engineering colleges as well. And so I think the message there is loud and clear. It's not just about what you're going through. First ask yourself, is it even necessary? For some of the skill jobs of the future, from video editors, graphic designers, so many other jobs, is maybe more hands-on experience than a degree that's going to get you far in life. So that really is the important parameter there. So I'm mindful of the time, Professor Capelli, and thank you so much for being with us today. My last question before we let you go, someone starting college today, what are the top skills or mindsets you suggest they should develop in order to succeed in what the changing environment will be when they graduate 4 to 5 years from now?
Well, I think the basic thing, which is in demand, and employers always say this is super important, is exactly what schools should be doing anyway, and that is learning how to communicate.
Right.
So can you write well? And you communicate and deliver some kind of presentation. Executive skills, how organized are you? Can you figure out how to manage projects? And can you think critically? Employers always say they want that. Whether they actually mean it or not is an interesting question. If thinking critically means you disagree, maybe they don't like that so much. But the things that colleges are good at are the things which you should try to get out of college. You should think carefully about what you can learn that matters to employers in some other context. So, for example, it is important to have certain computer skills. You don't have to do those in college. You can do those in the summer or during a break. You can take online courses in that. Pretty much for those skills, certificates are probably okay. And being able to show that you have had some experience, even if it's volunteering, is really important. But you don't have to do that in college. You can do that during your vacations.
Right.
And finding some place where you can help, a not-for-profit organization or something, and you can show that you did something, right? So not just hanging around, but I actually did something. So as you say, what employers absolutely want are the hands-on skills. And to demonstrate those, you have to show that you have done something. The great success of these coding academies in the U.S. has been not that they're any better at teaching you how to code. I don't think they are. But at the end of that process, they connect you to some organization where you do the work for them, and then you get a reference from them that says, I built the website for this not-for-profit, right? And that's what employers want to see. Now, none of that requires you to do that in college. Right? So I think you have to probably think about your preparation for the job market as a portfolio.
Right.
And the college experience is part of that. But don't expect the college to do it all for you because they're not good at it.
Right.
Nor
and
do you
it's
want
changing
them.
so fast. Right? Nor do you want them to do it because it's changing so fast. Because what is on the curriculum might be completely outdated and with new technologies coming in. So the spirit of the partnership. Yeah.
And the things that college is good at still matter a lot. And that is teaching you how to think, teaching you how to interpret things like data, teaching you how to communicate in particular, and also getting along with other people, at least in the U.S. That's why in-person classes, employers always like those. They don't care that much about online classes because they know that you're learning something about dealing with other people in class.
Absolutely. So it all comes down to the traditional old-fashioned skills, right? No matter how much progress.
Plus other things you got to get someplace else.
Sure. Now, which reminds me of this Japanese proverb, which goes something like this. And amazing teachers, and that's what I was coming on to, and hence I am reminded of this proverb. One day spent with a great teacher can add more value than 1,000 spent in isolation with yourself, because there's a wealth of information and there's experts. They know how to create that environment, that safe space in the class to help you think. And that really is the core. And other things, as you rightly said, these students also need to think dynamically, that the environment's changing very, very quickly. New technologies come up, and even before they can be integrated into the curriculum, maybe it's time for you to go out and start doing that on your own using alternative means, and networking, whether it's LinkedIn or, creating a LinkedIn account and having those sort of connections for your internships and job opportunities. I think what it comes down to is not expect everything to be served to you on a platter, is to have that hunger, that desire to do what needs to be done from your end as well.
I think that all sounds quite reasonable.
All right. Well,
we've solved the world's problems here.
We have indeed. Some of the biggest issues. All right. Well, it's been an interesting conversation, and from our audience, I would request you to share in the comments what your top takeaways were as we close this conversation here today with Professor Capelli, and we would definitely love to have you back at some stage next year, depending upon your schedule. And once again, I really thank you for your time today.
Thank you.
Thank you.